In 1763, the French and Indian War ended in a British victory, but enlarged England's debt. The British expected the colonists to pay the war debt, but colonists did not feel responsible for the war, so tensions arose. The British restricted the colonists from passing east of the Appalachian Mountains, causing the Proclamation Line of 1763. Salutary neglect ended after the French and Indian War, and the British stopped turning a blind eye to the colonists, ignoring the navigational laws. Along with that, England passed the Incorporated Goods Act, which specified which goods needed to come through England. This included indigo, tobacco, and lumber. The Molasses Act taxed molasses, which was a cheap sweetener that many commoners used in an attempt to pay back the British Crown. The Currency Act took away colonial rights to print their own money, forcing them to pay debts in specie. This was very unpopular among the colonists because most did not have gold. The Quartering Act said that if you were asked, you must house and feed a British soldier.
The Sugar Act taxed sugar, and it was the first act where its only purpose was to make the crown money. The Stamp Act taxed paper goods such as playing cards, marriage licenses, and etc. Stamp warehouses to produce stamps and stamp collectors were soon showing up again in America to raise money for the British military stations in the New World. James Otis, a lawyer in colonial Massachusetts, was an early advocate against British policies. He gained the term no taxation without representation. In 1765, Patrick Henry wrote the Virginia Resolves, which laid out the colonists' rights and applied James Otis's no taxation without representation. He believed that only Virginians should be able to tax Virginians, and if the people boycotted, Britain would listen. 27 delegates from 9 colonies formed the Stamp Act Congress. They wrote the Declaration of Rights and Grievances and sent it to the king, claiming that they are Englishmen and should have English rights. The Stamp Act Congress sent a letter of complaints to the king. They agreed upon a non-importation agreement where they do not import English goods. It's called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. The Sons of Liberty was a group of angry colonists who tarred and feathered tax collectors and burned down buildings in relation to British taxation.
The Townshend Acts taxed lead, paint, paper, glass, silk, and tea. The tax was put in place to support British governors living in the colonies, and the colonists responded quickly. The letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, a wealthy plantation owner named John Dickinson, wrote a letter challenging the idea of external taxes. He thought the king and parliament had no right to put taxes on the colonists for self-gain. In 1770, colonists and British soldiers went to head-to-head in Boston Square. The incident would later be known as the Boston Massacre. Word spread about the bloody massacre throughout the colonies as Paul Revere's engraving of the event spread hysteria. The enraging is remembered in history as an example of propaganda effects against the British. As the Sons of Liberty started to grow bigger and bolder, more notable events started to occur. The Gaspee incident in 1771 involved a British ship going after a colonial ship and being lured into shallow water. The SOL raided it and burned it to the sea. Resentment in the colonies started to die down after the Townshend Acts were repealed. It wasn't until the Tea Acts in 1773 were passed that resentment flourished once again. The British created a monopoly with the British East India Company to tax tea. Although they promised the cost of tea would be a cent less than before, the colonists didn't believe them. Later that next year, members of the SOC dressed as Indians got on board a British ship and threw 342 chests of tea overboard in an act of defiance against Britain. In response to the Boston Tea Party, Britain passed the Intolerable Acts. The part of Boston was closed, the charter of Massachusetts Bay Company is revoked, and any person suspected of hurting or killing a British official will be on trial and condemned to death.
In 1774, Britain passed the Quebec Act after signing a treaty with France saying that the colonists could not expand into French Canada. The colonists felt boxed in, and their resentment grew. Later that year, the 13 colonies formed the First Continental Congress. At this point in time, the colonists did not want independence, but merely wanted to make amends with the king. They issued the Suffolk Resolves, denouncing the Intolerable Acts, encouraging colonies to create militias for self-defense, suggesting boycott of British goods, and told the colonists to stop paying taxes. After the king ignored the stamped Congress's Declaration of Rights and Grievances and sent soldiers to take control of armories in Lexington and Concord, the perspective of the colonists changed directions. They met again and formed the Second Continental Congress in May 1775, and this time they knew they were going to war. They elected George Washington to be the commander of the Continental Army, drafted the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity for taking up arms, and wrote the Olive Branch Petition in a last-ditch effort to avoid war. Thomas Paine wrote The Common Sense to encourage colonists to break away from Britain. He spoke down upon monarchies and British rule. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence was written. The colonies drafted a document to declare their independence from Britain. This document will eventually begin the Revolutionary War between the colonies and Great Britain.